Hello. Hello, everybody. Here are the numbers growing. It's always so fun to see that when the numbers start growing. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. While we get set up here, I'm going to launch a poll question. I feel like if you've come to these, you're so used to all these questions, and we want to know if they've ever changed your answers. So while you're rating, we'd love to know what's bringing you to this new webinar today here at Prevalent. Are you doing project research? Are you here for education? You don't know where you are? That's fine. You'll learn something from a British chap named Thomas Humphreys, content manager here at Prevalent. And maybe you're a current customer. And if you are, thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking about assessing third-party risk management with ISO 27001. I'm Amanda. I'm your host today. And Thomas, like I said, will be here joining, and he is going to be giving you all the good content about this. Couple of housekeepings. You guys, you're all muted. We can't see you either, but we really want you to participate. There is Q&A at the end, and there'll be another poll question at the end. But if you have something that you're interested in asking Thomas, put it into the Q&A, not the chat, because it's a lot easier just to streamline that process through the Q&A. If you have any other questions, definitely put them into the chat when it's not pertaining to the conversation we have today. But that's about it from me. We'll get the recording will come tomorrow or early access today from myself. Be honest with your answers when we ask you questions, because I will be following up. My counterpart, Melissa, and Noel will be following up. And we want to definitely make sure that we can help you guys. So that's about it. So Thomas, I'm going to let you take it away. I'll end this poll. And let's change the slide here. Hold on. Where is the thingy? I can't see it. We already have a chat. Does Prevalent offer CP? Yes, some of them. We'll get back to you on that one. Okay, let's see here. I'm already failing this, you guys. It's not letting me.
Do you want me to try and take control, Amanda, or?
There's usually like dots, and it's not letting me do it. Hold on here. We're on to a great start, everybody. Hold on, let me stop share screen for a second and read. It's like stuck on my laptop. Okay, it's frozen on my computer. That's probably the problem. Hold on a second. Let's try this again. Here we go. There we go. From beginning, current slideshow. It's not letting me do it.
Do you want me to try and?
Yeah, do you want to try? It's like, do you hear the noise? It doesn't like me right now. I don't know why. See, this is why I don't do this, you guys. Yeah, it's frozen on my desktop here. So that's off to a great start. But the one you sent me was good to go.
Well, no worries. Let me see if I can share my screen.
Yeah, I'm not sharing anything. Technical difficulties. Please stand by, everyone. All right, while you're waiting, did everyone enjoy Super Bowl? How about the halftime show? I mean, it brought me back. I don't know if it brought you guys back, but it was a good time overall. All right, I see your screen. I can see your screen.
You're good to go.
It doesn't like my screen. I'm gonna go away now. If you guys need me, I'll be here. Good luck, Thomas.
No worries. Thank you very much, Amanda. And yes, hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Thomas Humphreys. I'm the content manager at Prevalent. I build assessments and third-party surveys based on many recognized frameworks, obviously not least ISO 27001 and other privacy and cybersecurity based frameworks. Obviously, the purpose today is to go through the 27001 standard and understand how you can use it when going about third-party risk management and focusing on some of the core controls that the framework provides. I'll give a high-level introduction to the standard. Hopefully, it should be a fairly familiar standard to many. Before going into, well, how does third-party risk management fit into the ISMS, into 27000? And then focusing on some of the core aspects of the framework and what organizations need to do and how they can approach these key controls. And then finally ending with what you can do now for those starting out on third-party risk management for the first time, but also those who already have a program in place and hopefully will find this useful and have some interesting insights into how it can use a standard such as 27000. Just briefly about myself, prior to joining Prevalent, I was an ISO auditor for just under 10 years, working across various certification bodies in the UK and in Singapore. Like many auditors, starting off in ISO 9001 for quality, but obviously progressing and moving on to areas such as 27000. As Amanda indicated, obviously throughout today, feel free to put some questions if you have any into the Q&A window or the chat window. And then obviously, hopefully with some time permitting at the end, we can go through some of those Q&As. To start with the introduction to the ISO 27000 standards, this is an international standard developed by ISO, the International Standards Organization, and it's their core framework for information security. The crux of the framework is about helping organizations sort of structure, sort of governance and risk management around information security and providing a platform for identifying and applying security controls. And as we'll see throughout today's webinar, there's quite a series of obviously controls, some of which are very relevant and directly affecting sort of third-party or supplier management. It's interesting to note this is not the first standard focused around 27001. The actual precursor to these was a standard called BS 7799, or the British standard, which was developed in 1995. So the concept of an information security management system goes some way back. This is actually developed in accordance with security professionals and also UK government. And it wasn't until the early 2000s when ISO was approached and engaged to internationalize this and turn this into a wider framework. And the first assessment, 27001-2005, was released. It came off the back of the British standard 7799. As you expect from most of these certification standards organizations, they go through a review on a periodical basis to make sure that these frameworks are relevant, they remain up to date, any new technologies, new and emerging threats and best practices, are they still adequate in the existing standard? And in this case, it was identified that no, there was a need for change, and that brought us to the 2013 edition. Interestingly, there have been future reviews of this framework, but it has been decided since then that actually the 2013 version should still remain current. And so there are no immediate plans to change the 27001 standard. It is worth noting, however, like you expect from many of these ISO standards, is this is one within a family of standards. So although they haven't changed 27001, there are wider standards that have been released focusing on how to apply this framework to certain sectors, certain industries, and implementation standards of how to imply and implement the security controls. The most recent of which, 27002, and perhaps the most well-known of the standards outside of 27001, was re-released yesterday. So 27002, 2022, is the most recent and up-to-date framework that brings in line sort of newer topics and readdresses some of the topics. It's quite a well accepted standard. There's more than 40,000 certifications currently in existence and circulation across more than 100 countries. So it is a global framework and a global standard. And it's interesting to note where these standards, these certifications are coming in. Given obviously the subject matter that we're going to go through today and that we know about 27000, it's obviously no surprise that information technology development-based organizations have obviously adopted it quite widely. But then there's a lot of other organizations in the healthcare sector, construction, equipment manufacturing, to name but a few, where they have adopted quite openly and understood the need for a 27001 framework. For those of you who are familiar with ISO, and particularly a lot of their core frameworks, 9, 27,000, 14,000, they're all built around this concept of Plan, Do, Check, Act, or PDCA, which again, I'll explain how this can be applied when looking at your third-party management as well. So the planning phase of identifying risk, identifying threats, identifying a governance structure, then applying a section of implementation, so implementing security controls, policies, procedures based on those risks, a continual checking and monitoring process, so continual reviews through internal and external means, audits, management reviews, technical reviews such as audit logging, and then obviously acting on the results of that and this concept of continual improvement. So continually improving the security controls that are in place, the policies, refining them where appropriate, and then even reviewing the risks as well to say, are they fit for purpose? Do they remain relevant to us as an organization, or are new and emerging threats coming up in areas that we need to consider? So the whole concept around these management systems, that they should be continually evolving, continually improving process, with the ultimate aim, of course, of maturing the security landscape of an organization, for example. So when you think about third-party information security risks, well, there's obviously a lot of risks out there. There's quite a wide-ranging sort of category of risk and type of risk. Perhaps some of the more pertinent, or I guess of recent times. So the cyber attacks is always worth mentioning. It is increasing the amount of malicious attacks, obviously ransomware, just putting out some key names out there, some keywords, SolarWinds, Kaseya VSA, Log4j, to name but a few. And obviously we've seen that this is something that's ever increasing across a range of industries and sectors. And obviously what's important here is to think about not only obviously how do these attacks affect us, but thinking about how do they affect our third parties and those organizations that we're relying on, providing a critical service to us, a critical product or component, for example. And so being mindful of this and being able to reach out to vendors and third parties and say, well, how are you dealing with this? This Log4j issue is a really big deal for us in our sector. Were you impacted? How did you approach it? Did you apply the best practices from security bodies, from manufacturers, and so on and so forth? Coming up to 4 or 5 years now of GDPR being in existence, and obviously other local national standards and regulations, such as the California Consumer Privacy Act in the United States, and adjustments that have been made to other national data protection acts. And of course, we're seeing an increased storage, collection and processing of data, whether it's personal data or, to use a GDPR term, PII, sensitive data or SPII, corporate data. The volume of data that's being spread around multiple third parties in some cases, again, is increasing the level of risk and increasing the level of data mapping that's required. Complex supply chains, so from a business continuity and disaster recovery perspective, certainly we are seeing in some cases that are growing volume of suppliers. We're not just talking about obviously third party now, we're talking about fourth party, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth party for some particularly complex cases or complex industries. And of course, that brings it a whole host of changes and a whole host of risks and challenges, but thinking about geopolitical, environmental issues and events. So the need to understand continuity and contingency planning, both internally as an organization, but also for your third parties and how they're managing the supply chain where appropriate. And then, of course, legal and regulatory pressures, again, are ever increasing in some areas, financial sectors, the legal sectors as well. And we're finding more emphasis, more pressure being put on the need to have greater privacy controls, greater security controls And so, of course, if you're in one of these sectors where there is more pressure from law enforcement or from the regulators, there's more emphasis for you to make sure you've done your due diligence to engage those third parties where there could be issues that could result in financial and legal penalties and problems later down the line. So this is just a few, of course, of many third-party security risk and risk types, but it's just extra emphasis to say that it's a good time to, if you're not already, of course, it's a good time to start thinking about your wider use of your information assets, and how you're using and engaging with third parties and fourth, fifth parties if necessary as well. So, question, how does TPRM, third-party risk management, fit into the ISMS, Information Security Management System, a term obviously used to describe or to label the ISO 27001 standard? So, although by and large 27,000 has always been generated to help businesses gain certification from themselves based on, as we've described, a clear and structured risk management approach, a set of security controls, and this PDCA concept, so continued improvement, monitoring, review, design, and application. But we can also apply it when considering, in the broader sense, how do you engage, discuss, and review and monitor your third parties. So certainly thinking about third-party risks themselves, where 27001 calls out in quite a lot of detail the need to identify information assets, the need to identify a structure of managing and calculating risk, so risk impact over risk likelihood, for example, this concept of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. We can apply this by saying, well, you can use the same approach to analyze your third-party risks, so having a systematic approach to identify what's critical to us and what's critical to our information assets, and those that are being supported by, managed by third parties, or where there's an individual component that's helping to provide the bigger picture, the bigger product or end service. So using that systematic approach that 27001 sets out from the beginning, we can use this to help frame how we identify and manage third-party risks. So it already provides a clear structure and approach to kicking off, documenting, and taking accountability and visibility of risks that would affect you. There's a catalogue of 114 security controls. So in 27001, this is called Annex A. So it's a list of controls. And the concept is once an organization has identified its risks through the high-level structure of 27001, there's then a suite of controls, quite wide-ranging. So everything from access control, personnel security, operational and network security, business continuity, and secure development, to name but a few. And the idea is that once you've identified the risks, you can then apply the suitable control or multiple controls to help manage that risk, treat it, reduce it where appropriate. Obviously, the list is not exhaustive, but in a similar way, now that we've identified our third-party risks and the risks that are going to most affect us, what controls do we need to use ourselves or ask third parties to implement that are going to address third-party access or use or support to information and information assets that they have access over. And so using those security controls and understanding which controls are going to be most appropriate given the type of access or interaction the third party has with our data, our information, or our information assets. And then finally, with this concept of continual improvement and the CA of the PDCA cycle, if you will, I've explained that Information Security Management System 27001 already sets out clear processes that can be implemented from internal and external auditing, management reviews, audit logging of systems, incident response management and incident management recording, vulnerability and threat management. But of course, these are aspects that obviously you can use and the organizations can use as well to engage with third parties and to make sure that there's a level of monitoring and frequency of monitoring. And on top of this, of course, the actual performance monitoring and service reporting that can be requested, obviously enforced through contractual arrangements with your third parties. And it's always important to mention risk at the end there. I've mentioned risk, might mention risk a few more times today, but it's all about this continual process of saying, when we've got a structure in place to identify the risks for our third parties, of identifying what controls are needed, and then as you'll see, how we apply them from a contractual perspective, from a monitoring perspective, based on changes to the landscape, based on those controls, based on the changing landscape of risk. How is our risk management system performing? Do we need to continually go back and review, is it working for us? Is it working based on the type of risks we're facing with our third parties, and in some cases, the wider supply chain? So what I'd like to do now is go into a deeper dive across two core elements that are split into 5 controls as part of this catalogue of 114 security controls. And this is part of A.15, which is supplier management in the ISMS. And we start with the information security and third-party relationships. Subheadings going down into information security policies for third-party relationships. And as we see further along, looking at the contractual agreements and arrangements, as well as looking at managing and being aware of the supply chain. So what do we mean by defining a third-party information security policy? 27,000 sets some clear guidance and requirements for how policies need to be identified, managed, reviewed. And of course, one of these is a policy to talk about how you engage, how you manage your third parties. So what do we mean here? Well, first, we're looking at third-party types and third-party risk relation and third-party relationships. So in terms of third-party types, thinking about, well, can we break down the type of third parties based on the service they're providing, whether it's service maintenance, whether it's development, application, software development, third parties, whether it's other aspects of information access and assets that we need to consider. And then the third party relationship, well, how do we engage with these third parties? What's the frequency with which we're engaging them? The type of contracts that we need to set up, the level of monitoring and service relationship that we need to build with these third parties. And once we've got this under control, once we've got this understood, we can now then begin to look at what types of information access are required by the third party. Certainly thinking about thinking about the type of supplier, the type of IT service, maybe a financial service, thinking about the type of access that they may need. Do we have third parties that we're engaging with who may have access to our sensitive data? Is there particularly our internal data or our employee data, our own customer data that they need to access, they need to store based on the type of service they're supplying? And based on that, can we start to break down the level of security, the level of scrutiny, and the requirements that we need to ask of them, that we need to dictate, that they need to implement? And once you've understood the type of information access required by the third parties based on the level of service, or based on the product and service they're supplying, identifying those minimum security requirements and controls. And also this is where it brings back to the wider Annex A selection as found in 27001. Some of them will be fairly high level, and you'd expect from all third parties, particularly any that are dealing or handling with any of your information assets. So the way they respond to incidents, for example, the way they respond to continuity and contingency, the way they access information assets, whether it's when they're coming on site to do a bit of support or maintenance work, for example, or whether it's you're sending information over to them and they're managing it on their site in their infrastructure. And so you're starting to piece together based on third-party types, based on the type of information and level of access required. What are the most appropriate security controls we need to press upon our third parties? And then we've got to this stage, then looking at the monitoring requirements. And again, this may depend based on the severity of the third parties. If you're starting to get to a stage where you're calculating or determining tiering of third parties, let's say tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, from the most critical, providing a mission critical component or service, through to ones providing supporting services that don't have an overriding bearing on the end product or system. We can then start to piece together, well, what level of monitoring do we need? Do we need monthly, quarterly, biannually, or annual service review meetings? Do we need reporting in place that they provide some level of statistics and statistical reporting based on service availability, service uptime, system availability, based on change and change management, as well as those areas that all vendors may need to provide incident response, for example. And then training in two parts. So from an internal training perspective, making staff aware of the security requirements when engaging with third parties, if there are some nuances or some particular controls that they need to be aware of and they need to be mindful of when engaging, to ask the relevant questions, but also if there's a need for training of the third party, if there's requirement, for example, if their third parties are being engaged to come on site to provide maintenance, is there some basic security and privacy awareness training that you would require the third party to attend? And then, of course, confidentiality. Obviously, we've talked about privacy and then the potential handling, storage, or use of and access to sensitive information. And so, of course, confidentiality, non-disclosure, common areas you'd find in many third-party contracts and agreements anyway. So these are the 6 of the key areas that we'd ask companies to consider when starting to develop an information security policy and policy framework. So it's a structure to help identify and consistently manage third parties. And of course, from this, we then move on to addressing security within supplier agreements. So capturing information security requirements in agreements, including stating minimum controls, both policy-based, technical-based, any legal requirements from a data protection, intellectual property perspective, communications, responding and being made visible of incidents and problems, business continuity events and threats, the right to audit and rights to audit, and consideration for fourth or nth parties starting to think about the wider supply chain. So we start with the minimum controls. By now, we should reach a stage where we've already identified the risks and we're quite clear on the type of controls and best practices we need to be confident in passing over to third party, and it gives us the confidence that our data, our information is obviously being protected in the best possible way. So what do I mean by policy-based control and technical control? There's always going to be some crossover between the two. Generally speaking, we're looking at information classification. So based on the type of data and information that you may be passing or sending across to a vendor, a third party to look after, and the company will undoubtedly have some level of classification in terms of how it protects the data, what rules should be in place, and how the data is handled, how the data is labeled, for example, and how it may be even processed. Employee screening checks. Is there going to be a requirement for you to ask for third parties who are accessing your information and or information systems to have some basic due diligence checks when they bring new employees in to work on the project? If you're outsourcing, for example, a key business process to a third party, and there are systems that are holding account level information, accounts payable, financial information, for example, even employee pay information, if you're outsourcing the whole pay process, where you want to be sure that the employees who are looking after that and who are helping to manage that pay process have been appropriately vetted where necessary, and at least there's due diligence that the third party can share the approaches that they've taken. Obviously, acceptable use policies, incident response, which we've covered in part, and obviously privacy, thinking about GDPR, thinking about CCPA, if there's localized frameworks or regulations in place, and even if there wasn't, other basic privacy policy-based controls. So a data privacy policy, for example, data privacy requirements and response management. And then, of course, technical controls to protect the data. So is there a need to underline and identify access controls, restrictions of access to your information systems based on least privilege, for example. Data storage, methods of storing the data, and levels of encryption. If the organization has minimum requirements for AES 256-bit encryption, for example, for data in REST, and the minimum of transport layer security, TLS 1.2, 1.3, because there are other obviously dated versions that are now dated and defunct and have poor security. It may be necessary for you to insist and try to enforce where appropriate that same level of encryption applies when that data is being transferred to a third party's site or operations. Retention and disposal of data, what happens after a project closes down? Are you happy for third parties to dispose of systems holding data in a secure manner to certain security standards? Do you require that any such systems are securely returned to the organization through secure courier and other means? And then obviously technical controls to manage privacy through the restriction of access, levels of encryption, and data loss prevention as well. So there's a whole series of controls, and the idea here is we start to incorporate them as part of the agreement, as part of the contractual requirements. Obviously, we've got legal requirements. I mentioned data protection, and there may need to be a method to enforce additional protection based on GDPR requirements, based on the type of data processing, the data use that's being managed by a third party. Communication, of course, is really important, starting to identify key points of contact, both internally and from the third party's perspective. So should a breach occur, should an incident occur, how are they going to respond to that? How are they going to communicate it back to yourselves as an organization? And in a similar vein for business continuity as well. Obviously, the right to audit is a common clause we find in many agreements now. It's not always acted upon, but of course, if it is, it gives an excellent opportunity to do a deeper dive into an organization, appropriately ring fencing and scoping an audit, but the ability to actually review, whether it's physically or through remote assessments or through surveys, that the controls are in place and are effective, is always a key area to consider in such contracts. And then, of course, consideration for fourth and nth parties. So that visibility of, we're passing you our information assets, or there's an agreement for you to help develop these or provide us with a piece of development. Are you outsourcing some of those components to your own third parties? Just bear with me, I apologize. It's getting slightly dark. And so how you manage and the visibility of fourth parties and the availability of what levels of data or access to information systems that those fourth parties have as well. So thinking about how you capture requirements for fourth parties, or at least requirements on the third party in terms of the due diligence that you would expect them to do, which could include applying some of the information security controls that you're asking your third party to adhere to as well. So then we move on to the information and communication technology supply chain itself. So being aware of how information assets are supported, used, or supplied across the wider supply chain, and identifying controls to monitor and manage the security risks associated with them. So I think there's four key aspects we should be looking at here when trying to incorporate and consider, well, how do we capture supply chain in a third-party agreement? So certainly one is critical components and provenance. Are we aware of the origins of a particular component? Is there appropriate traceability from the original supplier or third party through to our immediate engagement up to when it reaches us. Have we identified the critical components that are genuinely mission critical, and without these, there could be an issue that could result in a security weakness of a product, potentially loss of data, a loss of brand or reputational damage. And so being mindful of this and being mindful of how far down the supply chain we're aware of products and services. Obviously, information security controls. So I've mentioned obviously the controls that may need to enforce upon our third parties, and it may be necessary to extend these to the fourth and fifth and sixth parties where appropriate as well. So for example, if there's a particular system, I mentioned business process outsourcing, let's say your third party is managing those processes for you, they're managing the financials of the organization, accounts payable, employee payments and so forth, and they themselves then engage another party to help with the maintenance of those systems. Well, the fact that those fourth parties are now engaging with your third party to help maintain those systems when there are issues, when there are errors, you need to be confident that the fact that those four parties have achieved the level of due diligence, training, awareness, maybe access restriction controls as well, and have signed appropriate NDAs to make sure that they are they're mindful of the systems, that the third party is mindful of the systems that the fourth party is engaged with, and they've applied appropriate obviously security controls as well. Obviously, assurance plays a big part here, and it's through the performance reviews, through the regular monitoring of your third party and the level of engagement that you obviously can seek to gain that assurance of both from the provenance perspective that the products, the services that the fourth party are supplying are fit for purpose, and that they've applied the necessary security control and capability. Then also the type of controls, as we've mentioned from that example of the third party providing business process outsourcing, that those controls have also been appropriately applied. Just gaining that assurance and validation from the third party that they're doing the key checks that you'd expect they perform on the fourth party. And then, of course, reviewing security risks. So when threats occur, and by understanding the full journey of the component, and how far and how many fourth, fifth, sixth parties, when necessary, are used to deliver the end product back to you, should then help and should then be used to help review your own security risks. So going back to those third-party risks that we've established from the outset, do we need to review them? Do we need to adjust them based on knowing the complexities of the supply chain? Is there a need to increase the risk based on this level of complexity, or are we comfortable that the level of due diligence, contingency planning, business continuity has been enacted, has been applied, and that the third party is managing the fourth party in the way that we expect from a security and even from a privacy perspective. Then moving on to the second part, which is third-party service delivery management. And this comes from two aspects. One of them is the monitoring, audit, and review, and then managing changes. So when you think about monitoring, audit, and review, so validating that information security terms and conditions are being met. And we can achieve this in three ways. So one of them is to conduct a regular monitoring review of the third party, the performance reviews, the service reports. Secondly, through the use of the right to audit clause where applicable. And then finally, receiving timely communications relating to incident response and problem management, again, where necessary. So going back to the top here, conducting regular monitoring and reviews. I've already explained from a 27,000 perspective. There are a lot of different reviews and management reviews that can be conducted if you're looking at this internally. And of course, there are service reviews, performance reviews that can be taken with the third parties, frequency of which of course depends on the criticality of that relationship, the criticality of the third party. It's not uncommon to see monthly performance reviews of third parties, nor is it uncommon to see quarterly. and half yearly if obviously the performance is very strong, if the relationship is very strong, or if the severity of the risk or the criticality of that third party is such that it only wants a half yearly or even annual performance review. But thinking about the type of controls that we've applied at the contractual stage, and helping to build that into service reports that you may request to see. And this could be anything from reports and statistics on vulnerabilities, changes, even changes to suppliers and the supplier management controls that we're after. So the third party supplier or the fourth party as described. So starting to think about what types of statistics do we need to be assured that those security controls that we've asked the third party to apply, access controls, incident controls, information classification controls, whatever it may be, how can we be sure that those controls are being met? And it's through these regular performance reviews, these updates, and potentially even through service level agreements, objectives, SLAs and targets, that we can help to measure these based on the frequency and obviously complexity of these controls. The right to audit, I've mentioned, as I say, it is common to see that. And when we talk about the right to audit, obviously it's important, particularly nowadays, to look at this doesn't just mean physically turning up at a third-party site and conducting a full-blown assessment. The trick here and then the importance here is to obviously understand and to ring fence and to scope it correctly. And so it's clear that if you enact a right to audit, it's an audit against these functions, these processes, these controls, to make sure that if you're handing over key information assets, which could be obviously hardware, software, data, whatever the case may be, that you want to enact a right to audit to verify that those systems are being secure in the manner in which you've agreed with the third party. And then timely communications relating to incident response and problem management. So communication, I say, is very important, particularly the timeliness of it, not least where incidents, threats, vulnerabilities do occur. And this could be both threats that directly impact an information system, for example, that's being managed by a third party, but even ones that indirectly impact. So you may not have an immediate impact that's felt right away, but there may be other systems that have suffered some form of breach or some form of targeted attack, for example. And so it's enough for you to warrant a further investigation, a further discussion with that third party to say, what action plans are you putting in place? What is your response process? How are you dealing with it from a problem management perspective? So there's lots of different approaches and techniques to take in terms of monitoring, audit, and review. Obviously, it's important to identify these and to capture these as part of the third-party agreements and contracts. Then we move on to managing changes to third-party services. So assessing changes to third parties and the impact to business information systems and processes. So again, 3 areas should be considered: organizational change, changes to service provision, and agreement changes. We'll start at the bottom. That's I guess more clear. Obviously, there's always going to be a need to formally review contractual agreements, particularly when processes change, systems change, if there's a need to expand service delivery, to reduce service delivery, and having that formal process of working with the third party and understanding how these changes impact both yourself and themselves as well, and obviously the risks that may incur, the increase or reduction of risk in some cases based on how an agreement is being changed or adjusted. From an organizational change perspective then, so back to the organizational change, new system development, modification to policies, new controls. So if the organization, the third party you're engaged with, are updating their security policies, privacy policies, for example, maybe employee recruitment policies, anything that may have an impact, or they're applying new controls, they've enhanced some security controls, and they've got a stronger authentication system, for example, or they're strengthening other controls based on replacement of aged systems, for example. Of course, these are all positive changes, and that should hopefully also benefit yourselves as an organization. So being mindful and being made aware of such changes can help to understand and even reduce some of the risk that you've initially applied to the third party. And in a similar vein, changes to service provisions, the adoption of new products or newer versions and releases of systems. So third parties, if they've made the decision to improve, for example, systems to capture information are related to incidents and change management, that may be a positive thing. It means you may then be subject to greater levels of detail when changes occur. Should an incident occur, there may be a greater depth of knowledge that's captured as part of these enhanced products or updated versions. But then there's other critical areas to consider as well. Change in location of service facilities, for example. So if you have engaged with a third party to handle some of your information or information assets, and the initial agreement was that these would be held in a particular geography, certainly thinking about data privacy, for example, and let's say GDPR from a European perspective. If the third party now requests or is now proposing a removal from that facility to a different facility, well, that can also have a massive impact to the organization. Again, positively or negatively, depending on the type of facility move or location move. And so being made aware of this in a timely manner is absolutely mission critical, particularly if it means a review of security controls or privacy-based controls, if they're moving geographies or moving locations. And of course, change to suppliers as well. As I say, the supply chain is ever increasing, and there's some sectors where it is increasing to the 4th, 5th, 6th, sort of 7th degrees. And so, of course, if your third party changes suppliers and they add a new supplier to help better deliver a service, to provide a more structured service, for example, or because there's been an incident, something that's affected one of their suppliers down the chain, and they would like to move and change suppliers, if this obviously affects you directly or indirectly, then obviously it's critical that the organization is made aware of this and that has appropriate time to consider this, to review it, to engage with the third party, to understand the risk, the complexity, and of course challenge it as well, particularly if it's something that's going to greatly impact the information systems or solutions or information assets that the third party is using. So at this stage, we do a quick review. We've looked at, widely speaking, how the ISMS to ISO 27001 can be used to help identify third-party risk and apply and identify appropriate control through its clearly crafted risk management process, its use of Annex A 114 controls, and then of course the processes that you need to do to capture those information security requirements from a contractual perspective, and then have the process of continual monitoring, continual review, managing and reviewing and monitoring changes and being aware of the wider supply chain. So what do we need to do now? If you're just starting out on this process, the first step really is to start to identify your third party, start to identify and tier and even profile your third parties based on the criticality to the business, based on the type of information assets they're using, they're accessing, they're being given access to. So starting to adopt a rating for third parties based on the criticality, so high, medium, lows, red, amber, greens, tier 1s, tier 2s, tier 3s, whatever the case may be, but anything can help you structure your third parties and to say, these are our most critical and these are our mission critical to our end product and service delivery or our end customer, and these are critical to us, but are not going to give us too much concern from a risk perspective. And then obviously profile the third parties to help deliver that as well, to help identify the tier or category. So type of service being provided, type of data being handled, geographic location, whatever it may be, enough to paint you a picture of what that third party does and what suppliers and fourth parties that they're engaged with as well. And obviously, once we've got this under our belt, we can then start to develop this risk assessment process. So as I said, the strength of 27001 with a clearly defined risk approach to identify and manage risks. So certainly starting with identifying those third-party access or support of your information assets. What information assets do you have as a business, and which ones are being used, managed, supported by third parties? Identifying risk calculation, so the impact over likelihood plus CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's confidentiality of information, integrity of information, and availability of information. So it's thinking about the risk of a loss of CIA will have when thinking about creating and calculating your risk framework. And then finally, also identifying a method of recording the risk. Do you record risk through spreadsheets, through platforms, through a blend of both? Which approach are you taking to make sure you stay on top of and that allows you to continue to update and review your risks? Thirdly, also conducting the third-party risk assessment itself. So identifying third-party access and support of the assets, identifying the threats and the vulnerabilities, and right at the front, the cybersecurity risks, the business continuity risks, geopolitical risks, environmental privacy risks, whatever the case may be. Identify those threats and vulnerabilities most critical to the organization and how they'll be affected by the third parties, or how you'll be affected by your third parties. Obviously, the likelihood of occurrence of those threats and vulnerabilities, and then identifying and selecting those controls. Again, mentioning that obviously that 27001 is not exhaustive, but the 114 controls that Annex A does include, from access to operational, network security, and so forth, does provide a good backdrop or backbone to start to build up a collection of controls that are most appropriate and that you need to enforce upon your third parties. And then finally, creating and also executing a plan to address the risks. So developing that third-party information security policy, underlining control factors, security controls, privacy controls within third-party agreements and contracts, and incorporating supply chain requirements where appropriate. And then finally, obviously checking and acting. So the PDCA side, the check and the act on your third parties. So the continual monitoring review, performance review, setting targets and SLAs, and the continual improvement through reviewing the risks, through reviewing new risks, new and emerging areas that you need to maybe enhance and bring in new controls to deal with them. Obviously based on the third-party engagement, based on the type of information assets that they're managing for you. I'm going to pause there for now. I believe there's a few more sections that my colleague Scott may be covering. So at this stage, I'll hand back to yourself, Amanda.
Yep, Scott's going to take over. Thomas, if you want to skip through a couple of slides to, let's see here. Going.
Yeah, let's go right to the checklist slide.
Yep, checklist would be great.
Mm-hmm. There you go. That's it. That's all I wanted to share. Just a quick note to kind of draft off of what Thomas talked about in terms of best practices and setting up your framework and kind of unifying your questioning structures. Prevalence platform capabilities help you to assess your vendors based on these standards in a way that unifies the intelligence and help you kind of very quickly clarify what those control deficiencies are and what you need to do to fix them from there. To give you a head start, we published something called the ISO and third-party risk management checklist. It runs through the requirements that the third-party and supplier risk management requirements as they apply to the ISMS, and then define specific capabilities you need to look for in a solution, and then maps Prevalent into those requirements as well. We'll follow up with a link for you to download the paper on your own, but we've provided it here if you can type really fast. This is a great asset for you to kind of map against your existing ISO requirements and practices, what best practices look like from a third-party perspective. So, that's the only commercial I wanted to offer. I see a ton of questions come through, and they're all great ones. So I'm going to stop talking and flip it back over to the expert.
Which is not me, but I'm going to ask. Okay, you guys, I know we're pressed for time here. I just threw up a poll question. It's self-explanatory. I won't even read it. You guys see it there. Let's get to some Q&A right away. I'm going to go as fast as I can here from the top of the Q&A. If you put it in the chat, I'm sorry. I cannot scroll through right now. It's so much. But okay, first one is, why have certain sectors such as healthcare been more receptive to applying 27001?
That's a really good question. It's one that we try and stay on top of. Which sectors are more interested than others. I think given some of the, certainly from the UK, there have been some malicious attacks over the past several years that have certainly impacted some healthcare systems and healthcare organisations. And sometimes that's all it needs, the driver for regulatory bodies to say, we need to start implementing a platform. 27001, given how global it is, how recognized it is as a best practice standard, sometimes that's all it needs to help drive that. Typically where an industry adopts it, it's coming from either pressure from industry leaders, or from regulators. That tends to be where we find more. There's always a few surprises in there. I think I mentioned the construction industry. They have just circa of 300 certifications, I believe, currently. And some of the manufacturing industries have between 300 to 400 certifications. And this is obviously on a global scale, of course. It's highlight to point out. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So the next one is, are the 114 control ranked by importance?
They're not, no. So the concept is these 114 controls, as I say, split across quite a wide variety of subjects and subject matters. I mentioned access control and system development, but no, they're not prioritized in that sense. So the purpose is when an organization conducts a risk assessment through 27001, once you know the risks, and particularly once you know the risk to the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So the theory goes, once you know that, for example, the risk is greatest against a loss of confidentiality of data, for example, you can then work out through the 140 controls which are the best controls you should be applying to help to reduce the risk of a loss of confidentiality of data. But no, they're definitely not prioritized. It very much depends on the type of business, the industry you're in, and obviously the size and complexity of the business as well.
Okay, next question is, if a risk is already mitigated by a control, what do you do with it? Not include as part of risk assessment or classify it as low residual risk, or is that not a risk to begin with?
Can you repeat the question, Amanda?
Yeah.
Sorry.
If a risk is already mitigated by a control, what do you do with it? Start there.
If the risk is already mitigated. So if you've identified a risk and you know that there are mitigations, there are controls, policies, procedures, whatever it may be, training in place that has helped to lower the risk to such a degree that you can safely say we've mitigated. It could be simple enough to just maintain visibility of that risk, but you may need to not do anything further with it. You may need to address it and come back to it, of course, if something changes that warrants where there's a chance that risk could then increase. So, for example, if the original controls that were applied when you believed you mitigated that risk have changed, they've been reduced, or if that risk itself has become enhanced through new and emerging threats that are coming up. And this is why it's so important to do the continual review of risks to make sure that the risks you've initially identified and hopefully have mitigated or treated have remained so. And if they haven't, and if they have increased, that you can then review again and say, well, what additional controls or which additional actions can we take or should we take to bring this back down to a level that, as a business, that we are comfortable with.
So I'm going at random here for everybody. Another question is, are there samples? Are there sample right to audit clauses that one can incorporate in an agreement? Would a cloud service provider be penalized?
Cloud service provider be penalized? That's an interesting one. I don't think they'll be penalized. I mean, it all comes back, I guess, in part to the legal aspect of contracts. That is an interesting area that we do find a lot. If you're talking about some of these very large multinational companies, to say, you know, we'd like to audit you, and a typical response could be no. We're that, like, we do not entertain audits. I guess partly because if they allowed one, they'll allow everyone to potentially audit. And what we typically see there is they say, however, we are multi-certified. We have 27001, we have 22301 for business continuity, we have SOC assessments, and we can provide you with a lot of these certifications that we have across all our data centers, for example, or our critical infrastructure. If you cannot apply the right to audit, obviously there are other methods. There should be other ways to still review the security controls that are in place, particularly some of those organizations that say we are 27,000 certified, for example, we are SOC certified, we have 22301 for business continuity. There is other information also you can find out to give comfort to yourself that they do have sufficient control capability in place. And that may be enough. But yes, the right to audit, I'd say, can be tricky. It can be a contentious issue sometimes. But if you do have the ability to put it in place to say, based on our agreement with you, based on the level of service you're providing, we'd like to seek. We require an assessment of your controls that we've agreed that you'll apply. As say, and what's interesting here is it may traditionally have meant a physical on-site audit, as you would like an ISO auditor coming on site, but nowadays it could be a remote review. It could be another review that's counted as an audit.
Yep. Well, thank you so much, Thomas. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. We're already a few minutes over, but if your question was not answered, please reach out to us at info@prevalent.net. We'll make sure to get those answered for you, but we really do appreciate all of your time and those who stayed a little extra. So many questions. I wish we had more time for it, but definitely for those that are interested in knowing those answers, please reach out to us and we will get those questions answered for you. Thank you to Scott as well. Thomas, always a pleasure to see you. And I hope to see you all at the next one. Thank you all for your time today. Bye.
Thank you.